Welcome to Gemstone Kingdom, where history, power, and geology converge beneath the surface. Some stones are worn to impress, others to remember. But a few have rewritten borders. They've buried villages, bankrolled rebellions, and outlived the governments that tried to regulate them. From a crystal that once funded a child army to a green gem so valuable, entire militias were formed just to control it. These weren't just beautiful minerals. They were flashpoints in civil wars, proxy conflicts, and silent struggles that never made the headlines. They didn't just fund the war. In some cases, they made war possible. This is not about jewelry. This is about power, territory, and the price of what lies beneath. These are the top 10 gemstones that cause wars. If this is your first time here, feel free to like the video and subscribe to Gemstone Kingdom for more untold stories hidden beneath the surface. Top 10 Tanzanite, the stone that sparked a border standoff. In the hills of northern Tanzania, beneath the shadow of Mount Kilimanjaro, lies a narrow strip of land just 8 kilometers wide. It produces a gemstone found nowhere else on Earth, a deep indigo-violet crystal known as Tanzanite. When properly cut, a fine Tanzanite shows a trichroic shimmer, blue, violet, and burgundy, all in the same stone, depending on the light. Fashion houses describe it as a rival to Sapphire, but historians see something else, a powder keg wrapped in beauty. Tanzanite was discovered in 1967, just as Tanzania was emerging from colonial rule. The timing could not have been more dangerous. The stone's chemistry, a variety of zoisite with vanadium content, makes it stable enough for jewelry, but visually exotic. In fine quality, clean stones over 5 carats can command $1,200 to $2,500 per carat. High saturation stones over 10 carats, with custom cuts and GIA certification, can reach $10,000 per piece in the global luxury market. But very little of that money stays where the stone comes from. The region of Mererani, where all Tanzanite is mined, was quickly carved into 4 commercial blocks, A, B, C, and D. Block C was leased to a foreign company. Blocks A and B became state-controlled. Block D, the most chaotic, was left to local artisanal miners. That's where the violence began. With no clear enforcement, thousands of unlicensed diggers flooded the area. At night, rival gangs raided tunnels. At dawn, security forces evicted entire communities. Then came the Tanzanite Wars of the 2000s, a string of killings, sabotage, and disappearances linked to illegal extraction, military involvement, and organized smuggling. The Tanzanian government, fearing loss of national revenue, declared Tanzanite a strategic mineral. They ordered all cutting and grading to be done inside the country and built a wall around the Mererani mining zone. But that did not stop the blood. For over a decade, unofficial exports surged through Kenya and Dubai, bypassing taxation and traceability. International buyers paid cash, no paperwork. Stones were switched with synthetic lookalikes. Intermediaries vanished. And still the miners dug deeper, often without helmets, often with no claim papers, and often with nothing left to lose. Unlike diamonds or gold, Tanzanite's conflict was not globalized. It was localized, personal, and slow-burning, a civil war of attrition fought in mud and darkness over a mineral that glowed purple under polished glass. Today, Tanzanite is celebrated on runways, in catalogs, and even as the birthstone of December. But the price of a pendant in New York rarely includes the cost of buried tunnels, burned shacks, or broken arms in Mererani. For historians, Tanzanite is a case study in modern colonialism, not imposed by empire, but by demand. It did not start a formal war between nations, but it did precisely what war always does: divide the land, strip people with low incomes, enrich the absent. Top 9. Blood Diamond, the gem that financed civil wars. It was sold as a symbol of love, but funded one of the most brutal civil wars of the 20th century. From 1991 to 2002, Sierra Leone descended into chaos. At the center of it all, diamonds. Not the polished gems displayed in boutique windows, but alluvial rough, smuggled from riverbeds, cut in conflict zones, and sold through secret networks that extended from jungle encampments to Fifth Avenue showcases. A single 1-carat D-color, internally flawless stone, once polished and set, could retail for $15,000 to $25,000. But in Sierra Leone, that same diamond, uncut and dirty, could buy a truckload of AK-47s or a child's life. The Revolutionary United Front, RUF, a rebel militia, seized control of eastern mining districts. They enslaved villagers, amputated dissenters, and forced children to become both miners and soldiers. This was not theoretical violence, it was surgical. The rebels knew diamonds had no passports. All they had to do was move them from the hands of a 12-year-old boy in Kono province into the briefcase of a dealer in Antwerp, Dubai, or Tel Aviv. From there, it vanished into the system. Cut, registered, sanitized. By the time it reached a ring box in Paris or Los Angeles, no one could trace it back to the hands that bled for it. The international community called them conflict diamonds. But by the time the world named them, it was already too late. Over 50,000 people had died. The war spilled into Liberia, Guinea, and Côte d'Ivoire. Entire economies were destabilized, not by ideology, but by the opacity of the gemstone trade. In 2003, the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme was introduced, designed to track the origin of diamonds and prevent conflict stones from entering the supply chain. But loopholes remained. Smugglers routed stones through war-free countries, paperwork was forged, and global demand, driven by engagement culture, luxury branding, and the illusion of eternal purity, never slowed. Blood diamonds were never about beauty. They were about how beauty can be weaponized. For historians, the lesson is clear. Diamonds didn't fund one side of a war. They became the war itself, the currency, the goal, and the justification. And even now, decades later, stones mined under peace still bear the weight of those that were not. Because a diamond may be forever, but so is the scar it leaves behind. Top 8, Burmese ruby, the treasure that fueled a military regime. Some wars aren't fought with armies. They're fought with permits, checkpoints, and stones that never leave the ground. For over a century, the highlands of northern Myanmar, once called Burma, have produced rubies of extraordinary quality. Not pink, not dark red, but pigeon blood ruby, a luminous, saturated red with high chromium content and just enough silk to soften the glow. In the international gem trade, an untreated Burmese ruby over 3 carats with no secondary hues can fetch $50,000 to $200,000 per carat. More if it comes from Mogok and bears historical provenance. But in Myanmar, that value never meant prosperity, it meant conflict. The region of Mogok lies in the foothills of Shan State, a politically volatile area where the central government, ethnic militias, and the national military all claim partial control. Since the 1990s, ruby mines in the region have become contested economic zones. Armed groups extort miners. Military-linked companies secure exclusive concessions. Local villagers are displaced, taxed, or absorbed into labor networks. No formal war was declared, but the mechanisms of war were all present. Forced migration, controlled access to land, profits used to fund armed control, not civilian development. In 2008, reports from NGOs and rights organizations documented cases of child labor, dangerous working conditions, and enforced military protection fees on ruby pits in Mongshu and Mogok. At the same time, the international appetite for Burmese rubies, especially unheated stones, surged. Major auction houses began discreetly relabeling the origin. Luxury brands stopped listing Burma in their catalogs, but the stones kept moving. Smuggled through Thailand, cleaned in Bangkok, cut in Hong Kong, sold in Geneva. No embargo could stop what demand refused to question. By 2015, Myanmar's ruby industry was estimated to be worth $400 million to $1 billion per year. Yet very little of that reached miners, hospitals, or schools. Instead, much of it flowed into military-aligned conglomerates and local warlords. In 2017, the U.S. reinstated sanctions on certain Burmese gem entities, citing the role of rubies in financing state repression. And yet, stones still leave the country, often carried in person, undocumented, or mixed into shipments from Vietnam and Mozambique. For historians, the Burmese ruby is not just a luxury gemstone, it's a mirror of post-colonial extraction, a resource that should have built a nation, but instead funded its fragmentation. Today, a ring may bear a flawless red stone with no inclusions and no certificate of treatment. But without a traceable origin, it may also bear the legacy of displacement, suppression, and exploitation. The stone itself did not cause war, but its value and its secrecy made war a profitable outcome. Top 7. Colombian Emerald, the green gem. Behind decades of cartel conflict between the cocaine routes and the oil fields, Colombia has another underground empire, and for decades it ran not on drugs, but on emeralds. Some of the finest emeralds in the world come from a narrow stretch of mountains in the Boyacá department, north of Bogotá. Unlike Brazilian or African emeralds, Colombian stones carry a distinctive bluish-green tone, high clarity, and the kind of inclusion patterns dealers call garden-like. But for most of the 20th century, no one bought these stones without risk, because Colombian emeralds didn't come from corporations. They came from men with guns. In the 1960s, the government began to privatize the emerald fields, but the law never arrived with enforcement. Instead, a violent network of miners, landowners, and self-styled warlords began claiming shafts, hillsides, and roots. By the 1970s, the region plunged into what historians now call La Guerra Esmeraldera, the Emerald War. At its height, more than 6,000 people were killed over extraction rights, trafficking corridors, and betrayal between rival families. The most infamous of them all, Victor Carranza, a man known as El Patrón de las Esmeraldas. He built a private army, negotiated with guerrilla groups, and allegedly used emerald profits to fund paramilitary forces during Colombia's broader civil conflict. To outside buyers, emeralds kept flowing. Stones of 2 to 5 carats with high transparency and Muso origin certification regularly fetched $10,000 to $30,000 per carat. And museum-grade pieces? Over $100,000. But within Colombia, blood was spilled for every gram. Entire villages became extraction hubs. Family members turned against each other for control of a single vein. And when the cocaine cartels needed to move capital without banking exposure, they turned to emeralds. Stones couldn't be traced. They could be pocketed, swallowed, or buried. And once polished, no one could prove where they came from. The emerald market became both collateral and camouflage, used to justify violence, settle debts, and buy political influence. Peace did not arrive with law enforcement. It arrived when the warlords reached equilibrium. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a fragile peace settled over the emerald region, not through disarmament, but through private truces between rival stakeholders. But the legacy remained. Today, Colombian emeralds are still prized for their color and clarity. But behind every polished gem is a past carved not by geology, but by civil war, cartels, and control of what lies beneath. For historians, it is one of the clearest examples of a gemstone, not just funding a conflict, but shaping the very structure of who holds power in the country. Top 6. Ilakaka Sapphire, the blue rush that turned villages into war zones. In the middle of southern Madagascar, where there were once only dry plains and dirt tracks, a tiny village of 40 people transformed into a town of 60,000 in under 5 years. The reason? Sapphire. Discovered in 1998 near the sleepy crossing of Ilakaka, the stones that lay just beneath the surface weren't ordinary. They showed a spectrum: deep blues, vivid violets, pastel yellows, and rare pink-orange padparadscha. Many were gem quality, some rivaling sapphires from Sri Lanka and Burma. Within months, miners arrived from every province of Madagascar. Then came migrants from Sri Lanka, Thailand, Senegal, Nigeria, even as far as Cambodia and Vietnam. No passports, no oversight, just shovels, buckets, and a promise of fortune. By 2001, Ilakaka had no police force, no running water, and more than a dozen unregulated mines are operating day and night. The land belonged to no one, and everyone fought to claim it. Violence was constant. Entire zones were controlled by gangs armed with machetes or smuggled rifles. Sapphire buyers moved in convoys, escorted by hired guards. Murders went uninvestigated. Bribes replaced taxes. In a decade, Ilakaka became what one NGO described as a frontier town without a border. But the sapphires kept flowing. Raw stones, some just a few grams, crossed oceans and reappeared in Bangkok or Geneva, polished and set into luxury pieces. Prices varied wildly. A 2-carat untreated blue sapphire from Ilakaka could fetch $2,000 to $5,000 if clean, while pink stones or rare bicolors reached $10,000 plus per carat in high-end markets. Almost none of that value returned to the miners, and with no national regulation until the late 2000s, illegal traders dominated the region. Some sapphires were traded for cash. Others were exchanged for weapons. More than once, security clashes broke out between rival smuggling networks. No formal war was declared, but Ilakaka became a zone of low-intensity conflict, where resources, not ideology, dictated life and death. Eventually, the Malagadi government attempted to reassert control, but by then, over 500,000 carats had already left the country unrecorded. For historians, Ilakaka is a modern parable of post-colonial extraction, a mineral discovery that promised prosperity, but delivered only chaos, crime, and power in the hands of those with the fastest trucks and the sharpest knives. Sapphire didn't just fuel violence, it rewrote the geography of control in southern Madagascar and left behind a scar still visible in every abandoned pit and every unmarked grave. Because when value moves faster than law, the ground always answers with violence. Top 5. Opal, the firestone that ignited Australia's mining riots. It's one of the only wars over gemstones ever fought on Australian soil, and most Australians have never heard about it. Lightning Ridge, a dusty stretch of New South Wales outback, is the world's primary source of black opal, a stone that flashes with color under even the faintest light. These aren't common opals. A high-grade Lightning Ridge black opal can show electric blue, green, red, violet in one stone, shifting as it moves. No two are alike. Top-quality stones over 10 carats, with full spectrum, play of color, and no cracks, have sold for $20,000 to over $100,000, depending on the pattern. But in the 1930s through 1950s, before any international demand existed, Lightning Ridge became a town of confrontation. Independent opal miners, called scratchers, worked by hand, digging narrow shafts and staking claims on unmarked plots. Some were war veterans. Others were drifters. Most had no legal training, no survey maps, and no protection. When seams were discovered, boundaries shifted overnight. Shacks were burned, claims were dynamited, tools were sabotaged, and when outsiders, including British, Japanese, and American investors, began arriving with cash and machines, tensions exploded. The locals viewed mechanized mining as theft. The newcomers saw it as modernization. Neither side blinked. For nearly 2 decades, Lightning Ridge became a frontier without law, not through civil war, but through constant, small-scale violence. Pit sabotage, illegal claim jumping. Fistfights turned fatal. Local police were too few, too underfunded, and often unwilling to intervene. Even into the 1970s, miners carried rifles in their utes and slept beside their gear. Indigenous land claims, long ignored, further complicated the picture. As ancestral grounds were dug up without permits and entire ridgelines were blasted without consultation, the opals kept flowing. Buyers from Sydney, Tokyo, and Los Angeles paid in cash. Stones disappeared through unregistered sales, often from hull to plane in under 48 hours. Some miners became legends. Others disappeared, their names etched only on beer-soaked pub walls and abandoned shafts. Today, Lightning Ridge is quiet. Tourism brochures show color, character, and charm, but the scars remain, buried in collapsed tunnels, forgotten disputes, and families split by invisible seams of stone. For historians, the opal wars of Lightning Ridge weren't a national conflict. They were a slow interior collapse. when law moved slower than greed and beauty became just another reason to fight. Because even in a modern democracy, a gemstone, if rare enough, can still redraw the rules of the frontier. Top 4. Baltic amber, the ancient resin behind modern smuggling wars. It doesn't sparkle like a diamond. It doesn't cost $10,000 a carat. But amber, fossilized tree resin over 40 million years old, has caused more armed conflict than most people realize, especially in Eastern Europe, where it's not just a gemstone, but a billion-dollar black market. The most coveted amber in the world is found along the Baltic belt, stretching from Kaliningrad to western Ukraine, through parts of Belarus and Poland. The Kaliningrad region alone holds over 90% of the planet's amber reserves, and much of it lies just a few meters beneath sandy soil. It's light enough to float in salt water, soft enough to carve, and glows with a warm, honey-red fire under UV light. And in China, where demand for amber jewelry, amulets, and carvings has surged in the last 20 years, certain pieces can sell for $5,000 to $50,000, especially if they contain fossilized insects or rare colorations like blood amber. That demand created a storm. In Ukraine, particularly the regions of Rivne, Zhytomyr, and Volyn, vast forests became war zones. Illegal amber miners, sometimes entire villages, began digging by night, armed with generators, hoses, and assault rifles. Police sent to stop them were outnumbered, often bribed, and sometimes shot. In Belarus, military patrols were deployed. In Kaliningrad, the Russian state declared amber a strategic material, placing it under tight control. But not before organized crime had already set up networks to move it westward or east to Asia. These weren't isolated smugglers. This was a full-scale amber mafia, mining with illegal hydraulic systems, protecting zones with private militias, laundering profits through pawn shops and fake antique markets. According to investigative reports between 2014 and 2019, over 300 tons of amber left Ukraine without permits, and many of those routes crossed into Poland, then disappeared into global markets. In some towns, amber became more profitable than arms or drugs. But with no regulation, the cost wasn't just environmental, it was human. Violent clashes broke out between rival gangs. Police and journalists were attacked. Protesters demanding state reform were silenced by those profiting from the chaos. In 2016, one Ukrainian official called it plainly, "We are no longer fighting crime. We are fighting for the state itself." For historians, the amber wars of Eastern Europe are not simply about resin. They are about power vacuums. When borders blur, states weaken, and a natural resource becomes more powerful than the institutions meant to control it. Amber didn't declare war, but it created territories of permanent tension, where guns, money, and silence traded places. And the only thing glowing brighter than the stones was the danger of touching them. Top 3. Lapis Lazuli, the royal blue that funded insurgencies. It was once ground into powder and painted into cathedrals. It adorned the eyes of Egyptian pharaohs, and for over 6,000 years, lapis lazuli has been traded across empires, from Mesopotamia to Venice to Mughal India. But in the 21st century, this deep ultramarine stone became something else entirely, a battlefield currency. The world's finest lapis comes from a single region, the Sari Song mines of Badakhshan province, northeastern Afghanistan. These mines are ancient, and so is the conflict surrounding them. Modern lapis is prized for its color, a rich royal blue, sometimes with flecks of golden pyrite or bands of white calcite. Carvable, polishable, and durable, it's used in beads, jewelry, mosaics, and even luxury watch dials. High-grade rough sells for $200 to $400 per kilogram, but carved pieces and cabochons can reach $1,000 or more per unit, especially with deep, even color and minimal calcite. But unlike diamonds or emeralds, lapis has no international traceability. And in Afghanistan, a country where institutions are fragile and control shifts by the year, that makes it incredibly valuable to those who rule by force. For much of the 2000s and 2010s, the mines of Sarisang were not controlled by the government, but by armed factions, including groups aligned with the Taliban. They extorted local miners. They demanded transit taxes from every truck leaving the valley, and they sold access rights to Lapis zones to the highest bidder, regardless of law. According to a report by Global Witness in 2016, the Taliban earned millions of dollars per year from Lapis alone, making it their second largest source of income after opium. The international community called it a conflict mineral, but there was no Kimberley process for Lapis. No embargo, no oversight. The stone continued flowing. Carved in Peshawar, sold in Dubai, set in gold in Istanbul, buyers rarely asked where it came from, and sellers rarely answered. Meanwhile, the local population in Badakhshan remained impoverished and unprotected. Tribal councils fought for influence. Militias launched raids to take control of pits. In some cases, villagers were forced to work under threat. In others, the mine entrances themselves became the front lines of armed standoffs. This wasn't a war over Lapis, but Lapis made the war sustainable. For historians, it is a textbook example of how a semi-precious stone, beautiful, ancient, and culturally revered, can become a modern instrument of insurgency finance. Even after the regime change in 2021, reports suggest that Lapis continues to be mined and moved through the same networks. Quietly, profitably, and without interruption. It's sold as art. But underneath the blue is the gray of a conflict that refuses to end. Top 2. Ceylon Zircon. The gem entangled in a nation's civil divide. Most people think of zircon as an imitation diamond. They're wrong. Genuine natural zircon, especially from Sri Lanka, isn't synthetic and isn't cubic zirconia. It's a high-density, doubly refractive gemstone, often found in hues of honey, champagne, golden brown, or vivid blue after heating. And during one of Asia's longest-running civil wars, it quietly became a tool of endurance, funding fighters on both sides. Sri Lanka, long known as Ratna Dwipa, or Island of Gems, has produced sapphires, garnets, spinels, but among gem buyers, zircon from Ratnapura is prized for its brilliance, density, and clarity. Stones over 5 carats, naturally golden or blue, can sell for $300 to $1,500 per carat, depending on cut and saturation. But in the 1980s and 1990s, zircon wasn't sold in luxury stores. It was moved in pouches across riverbanks and between hidden field camps. As civil war escalated between the Sinhalese-led government and the Tamil Tigers, LTTE, the gem-rich southern and eastern provinces became strategic zones, not just militarily, but economically. Gem pits were small, shallow, and hard to regulate. Most zircon mining was artisanal, done by local villagers or small family units. But as conflict engulfed the region, those miners became vulnerable. LTTE forces taxed mining operations in Tamil areas. Government troops in the south extracted bribes or seized stones in transit. Smugglers operated in both directions, and in some provinces, mining became the only functioning economy left. The money from zircon sales, modest in value but consistent and hard to trace, was used to buy food, fuel, and eventually weapons. Reports from NGOs in the 1990s documented cases where zircon was bartered directly for military equipment through routes in India and Southeast Asia. It was small enough to avoid radar, valuable enough to be worth moving, and unregulated enough to avoid accountability. While the world focused on opium, arms, and international aid, zircon remained invisible, yet essential. Even after the war officially ended in 2009, tensions surrounding mining rights in the Ratnapura and Batticaloa regions continued. Ethnic groups accused each other of historical land theft. Former fighters re-entered the gem trade under different flags. For historians, zircon is a symbol of how ordinary resources, when left unmanaged, can deepen extraordinary violence. It wasn't rare, it wasn't precious in the global sense, but it was local, it was mobile, and it became a quiet enabler of war. Today, Sri Lankan zircon is back in jewelry catalogs, often marketed as vintage brilliance or affordable sparkle. But few who wear it know that decades earlier, the same stone helped pay for a war that left over 100,000 people dead. Top 1. Imperial Jadeite, the green gold driving Myanmar's hidden wars. It doesn't glitter like a diamond, it doesn't fracture like emerald, but Imperial Jadeite, the finest in the world, has funded one of the longest-running conflicts in Asia and claimed more lives than any other gemstone in the last 40 years. The highest quality jadeite comes from Apakant in Kachin State, northern Myanmar, a region that is mountainous, forested, and almost entirely outside the government's control. For centuries, jadeite has held spiritual, political, and economic power in East and Southeast Asia, particularly in China. The very best stones, semi-transparent, with saturated emerald green and no chemical treatment. They are worth more per gram than gold. Fine jaded cabochons can command $10,000 to $80,000 per piece. Premium matched bangles or bead necklaces have sold for $5 million to $30 million, often in private, undocumented transactions. That kind of value creates gravity, and war follows gravity. Since the 1990s, control over the Pakant jade mines has been contested between the Tatmadaw, Myanmar military, the Kachin Independence Army, KIA, and powerful military-linked conglomerates. In the official narrative, jade extraction is a national industry. In reality, it is a fractured network of backroom deals, smuggling, and paramilitary protection. Dozens of companies operate legally, but pay informal taxes to local commanders. Thousands more dig illegally, sleeping in tents beside toxic slag heaps and braving landslides, raids, and armed enforcement. In 2015, Global Witness estimated Myanmar's jade trade to be worth over $30 billion annually, more than half of the nation's entire GDP at the time. That money didn't build hospitals. It built factions, militias, and an informal state within a state. Proceeds from jade sales, especially in China's border provinces, were laundered through casinos, shadow banks, and luxury auctions. Stones were hand-carried across borders with no documentation. Jewelry sold in Shanghai or Taipei had no country of origin tag, and every time a buyer paid cash, another truck in Kachin was loaded with fuel, soldiers, or weapons. For decades, conflict over jadeite enabled the Kachin conflict to persist, even as international observers focused on more visible crises. In some periods, jade income rivaled that of narcotics or timber. In others, it was the only revenue source that kept militias operational. Civilian mining deaths numbered in the thousands, not from combat, but from landslides, tunnel collapses, and gang-related violence. Today, after political upheaval in 2021, jadeite remains a strategic mineral in Myanmar, not because it's rare, but because it's powerful. It empowers those who don't answer to the Constitution. And for historians, no other gemstone has so consistently translated mineral wealth into human cost. Jadeite didn't just fund a war. In Myanmar, jadeite became the reason the war could never end. Stones don't fire weapons. They don't sign treaties. They don't draw borders. But across centuries and continents, the ground has given up minerals so rare, so valuable, and so challenging to control that people were willing to kill for them. In some wars, gemstones were the trigger. In others, they were the fuel. And in the worst cases, they became the only thing left to fight over. What begins as geology becomes currency. What starts as color ends in conflict. These 10 gemstones did not cause war by themselves, but in the hands of power, silence, and scarcity, they became more than beautiful. They became dangerous. And long after the last shot is fired, some of them still glow. Thank you for watching and for staying with us through the histories that shine and the ones that burn. If this changed how you look at the world beneath your feet, consider subscribing to Gemstone Kingdom for more untold stories carved in stone. We'll see you in the next episode.